The current situation of undocumented immigrants in the state of Washington. The months of July and August 2007 have shown an increase in raids and detentions. One possible underlying cause for this increase is that changes have been made to local laws or their enforcement by the Department of Homeland Security. These changes lead to the detention of undocumented people who are involved in situations that include domestic disturbances, transit or traffic violations, domestic violence, civil behavior, etc. On Saturday, August 11th, like every second Saturday of the month, a group of people gathered for a vigil outside of the Northwest Detention Center. However, this time, the event was highlighted by the presence of both city and riot police.
Tanto miedo pasar a Es como un cárcel, ¿verdad? Se ve como un cárcel. My name is Heather Day. I'm here with the Community Alliance for Global Justice and the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. And I'm joined by members of those organizations and many other organizations who are here today just to show solidarity with the families who have people inside this Northwest Detention Center, which is where the ICE, Immigration, Customs, and Enforcement Agency, sends people when they are arrested for immigration infractions of one kind or another, whether they're documented or undocumented.
The uncertainty surrounding migrant reform in the Congress, reform that will put a stop to the detention of fathers and mothers that have been in the United States for many years and who in fact have children born in this country, has created a lot of insecurity.
Sweetheart, every time I look at you, something is on my mind. If you do what I want you to, baby, we'd be so far. Oh, life could be a dream. It could be a dream, sweetheart. Shaboom, shaboom. Ya la 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 shaboom. Ya la 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 shaboom, shaboom. Ya la 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 shaboom.
A lot of times when people find out that I decided not to go back to the war because I had a real problem with the civilians that we killed in Iraq, they tell me that when you joined the military, you knew you would be killing human beings. You knew that innocent civilians would die, and you had trained for it, and certainly I did train for it. I was an infantryman for 8 years when I deployed to Iraq, and I was a staff sergeant, and I was infantry squad leader. So I had done the training, and I had the knowledge and the expertise to do my job in Iraq. But I was 19 years old when I signed up for the military. At 19 years of age, we're not even able to buy alcohol. Yet, when a young person decides not to participate in war, they want to say that you knew what you were doing when you signed that contract. And this is separate from political opposition to the war. This is separate from being a conscientious objector. This just has to do with just how unnatural it is for a human being to kill another human being. There's no training that prepares someone for that type of experience. This is from page 89 of the book. Sergeant Williams, my platoon leader, came running back from the first floor with intel from Bravo Company. The first sergeant had told Williams to hold tight as they were getting ready to send out a civil affairs team to try to persuade the crowd to go home peacefully. They deployed a Humvee with an American female translator, a soldier, speaking Arabic through a bullhorn, requesting the Iraqis to leave the area. Then a grenade exploded right next to her Humvee, which was heard speeding off out of the area. Sergeant Mejia, let's go, said Sergeant Williams. We're going to the roof to pull overhead security. Sergeant Ritz, another soldier from my platoon, a superb shooter who always carried his sniper scope, came with us. Sergeant Williams placed him in a strategic corner from where he could see the entire rally ground. My squad was positioned along the front of the roof. It was easy to tell when someone from the crowd was going to throw a grenade. The assembly would quiet down all at once and would move as one to one side of the street, far enough away to avoid injury from the blast, but close enough to see where it hit and scream and cheer for it. Bravo Company soldiers, I was in Charlie Company, who were outside in the compound, were yelling at the demonstrators and trying to intimidate them with their weaponry. A black plastic bag landed near one of them and started smoking. They all ran as fast as they could away from it, narrowly escaping injury from a considerable blast. Later reports indicated that some of those throwing explosives were children. The order came to move all friendly elements away from the immediate ground area, and for those on the roof to shoot at anyone who looked like they were going to throw a grenade. So this is when there was actually no danger. The crowd was still in the middle of the street, and I sensed that they saw the withdrawal of our troops from the front yard as a victory. They returned to the area immediately in front of the main gate, yelling even louder and holding their "No Bush, Yes Saddam" signs even higher. At that point, the Iraqis felt quiet again, and everyone moved to the side of the street. They were all looking toward an area of the street that was hidden from our view. I remembered it was a street corner where there was a shop of some kind, with a balcony right above it. It was the same building where one night there had been a short firefight between insurgents and 3rd Platoon. It was said that 2 little girls were shot in their sleep that night, but those reports were quickly denied by the civil affairs people. Now, from a corner of that same building, a young man could be seen emerging from the watching crowd. He was wearing gray slacks and a long-sleeved shirt of the same color. He was very young, perhaps 16 or 17 years of age. I followed him through the aperture of my M16 sight. "What are you doing, man?" I thought to myself. He continued to walk toward the walled-in yard of the compound, which was now deserted. He pulled his right hand out of his pocket, and I could see it contained a small black object. He drew his arm back. I have no memory of squeezing the trigger at the moment that a storm of bullets rained down on that young man, ending his life at once. I remember the grenade he threw exploded near where he died, far from all of us who shot at him. I also remember a couple of old men emerging from the crowd after we ceased fire, their arms held up to show they were unarmed, their heads bent. They grabbed the lifeless body by their shoulders, dragging the young man through a pool of his own blood. They moved back quietly until they were swallowed once again by the crowd, now silent, in mourning for the loss of their son. The rally resumed shortly afterward, and we ended up having to call helicopters to disperse the people. The total body count for that demonstration, unofficial as usual, was 4 dead and several wounded. All were Iraqis. We were told to go back inside the building after the crowd finally left. We had to get ready for more patrols around the city. I went to a dark and isolated corner of the building and sat down for a moment, away from everyone's sight, and removed the magazine from my rifle. I had 19 bullets left, which meant I had fired 11 rounds at that young man. This was the first time that I actually fired my rifle at something that was not a plastic target. Throughout the whole time that I was in Iraq, I had a deep conflict with a lot of the things that were going on, but I was also very afraid because the situation was so intense that the main preoccupation that I had was to survive. And also because I did not want to rebel in an environment where everybody was being complacent and everybody was being obedient. And I did not want to be the one person to stand up and say that this is wrong. But eventually, I came home for 2 weeks, and then I was supposed to return to Iraq. And that's when I had the peace of mind and the clarity and the time to think about what happened. And when it came the time for me to get back on the plane, I just didn't. I can't say that I had the strength to make that decision to say, this is wrong, therefore I'm not going to be a part of it. I just simply did not get on the plane. But I was too afraid to make that decision, so I just slept when I was supposed to get on the plane. And I told myself that I would go back the next day. And then when the next day came around, I told myself again that I would go back the next day, and then the next day. Until one day I realized that I wasn't going back to Iraq. But even at that point, I was struggling with the guilt of leaving Iraq and leaving my unit behind because of the bond that had been built, which was a very special and very strong bond between the men in my squad and myself. Because we had been together in a situation in which, regardless of the politics surrounding it, our lives have been in the hands of one another. So I carried a lot of pain with me as I decided not to go back to Iraq. And this talks about that on page 234. I walked the streets of the massive anonymous cities in the northeastern United States, spending entire afternoons in parks and museums, working on my never-ending conscientious objector claim, closing my eyes only to watch my resolve drown in the fear of my eventual public surrender, living in panic of the military and the government, afraid of the future, unable to really live. I felt like a coward for being unable to act on what was clearly my moral duty. Every time I thought of going back to the military and going public with my decision not to go back to Iraq and my denouncement of the war, the deafening pounding of my heart paralyzed me. You are so courageous, people would say, who knew about my situation. You are going to lead the way in a new movement of dissent within the military. Many more will follow you. I would nod my head in acknowledgement, registering the words, but often thinking about the punishment that would surely follow, and worrying about my own resolve. And I would think, am I really courageous? I haven't done anything yet. And then other words would come to mind. There has to be a first one, a voice that breaks the silence. There needs to be a first one. And what I needed to do would become clear again. A key event occurred after one of my visits to see Lewis in Massachusetts. Lewis was my attorney. I was accompanied by Nancy Lessing and Charlie Richardson, who had co-founded a grassroots anti-war organization called Military Families Speak Out, which my mother had joined back when I was still in Iraq. After a long conversation with Lewis about my return to the military, Nancy and Charlie took me to a place some 40 minutes outside of Boston that would play a major role in my eventual surrender to the Army, the Peace Abbey in Sherborne, Massachusetts. The Abbey is a place that must be experienced in order to be understood. No words can capture the spirit of the place that later became like a second home to me. A life-size bronze monument of Gandhi welcomes visitors, and the grounds include an animal sanctuary that houses a cow, 3 pigs, a donkey, and 2 goats. The sanctuary is always open for people to spend time with the animals. Just outside the stable, at the base of a small hill, there's a tombstone inscribed with the words, "Unknown civilians killed in war." The memorial was unveiled by former heavyweight boxing champion of the world, war resister, and conscientious objector Muhammad Ali in 1994. A couple of 3-story New England homes flank the stable and overlook an old cemetery just outside of the state. One of the homes is a retreat with 4 rooms for visitors in search of peace and quiet, a multi-faith chapel, a vegetarian kitchen, and a small library with a collection of books about peace and about the atrocities of war. The walls of the Peace Refuge are lined with news clippings about people who have paid a dear price for their peace activism, and with relics of saints and people killed in their struggles for social justice. The first time I entered the house, I was struck by the soothing spiritual music that filled the place with a sense of peace and harmony. I was then surprised by the sound of a mystical yet familiar refrain, the Islamic call to prayer. This was the first time I had heard the call since I had returned from Iraq, and it served as a reminder of the interconnections between people around the world, the unity of humankind that had brought me to the Abbey. In a corner of the main house, inside the multi-faith chapel, there is a shrine dedicated to the late Monsignor Oscar Arnulfo Romero, the Salvadoran archbishop who was assassinated in 1980 because of his commitment to peace and justice, making him the first bishop slain at the altar since Thomas Becket in the 12th century. Photos of the moments after the archbishop's slain were displayed next to a piece of blood-stained cloth from the altar at which he delivered his last mass. Monsignor's glasses were on display right next to the blood-stained cloths, enhancing both his powerful spiritual presence and the price he paid for speaking truth to power. On the walls of a hallway of the other house were pictures of children. A legless child, severely mutilated by landmines, stared at me from one of the pictures. Another photo on the wall showed a newborn baby coming to this world only to live a few moments of hell before dying. He had been born with extreme deformities caused by depleted uranium, a radioactive material used by the U.S. military to build munitions and armored plates for vehicles. Upon impact, depleted uranium-based projectiles and armored plates pulverize and get into the air and water, contaminating everything in their path and condemning people, including soldiers, civilians, and even unborn children, to a life of severe pain, deformity, and death by disease. I didn't speak while looking at these pictures, but as I stared at the horrific images, I was aware of a change occurring inside of me. I began to feel ashamed of my fear of going to jail and of being called a traitor. I realized that I had been a coward from the very beginning when I should have refused to be sent to war but did nothing. In Iraq, I had seen and participated in the brutal and abusive treatment of prisoners and civilians, but had lacked the courage to disobey orders. Now, faced with the moral duty to publicly refuse and resist the war, I was paralyzed once again, too weak to break the chains of my own fear. But looking at the faces of those children from times and lands unknown to me, I felt a new resolve and realized that I did have the strength to give myself up and to speak out when doing so. So I eventually surrendered to the military, and I went public in my denouncement of the war and in my refusal to continue participating in what I consider to be an illegal and oil-driven war. And I declared myself a conscientious objector and said, no, I would not participate. And at the time, I was the first combat veteran. We already had public resistors, but I was the first combat veteran to come back from the war and publicly denounce war crimes and publicly refuse to go back to Iraq. So obviously there was a lot of media attention around it, and the case became very politicized, and the military 2 months later, after my surrender, decided to try me by basically a political trial, and they refused to listen to my arguments of abusive treatment of prisoners, torture, the killings of civilians, and violations of several international laws. And we called the entire legality of the invasion into question because we claimed that because the war was not in self-defense, nor did it have the approval of the UN Security Council, it was illegal. But none of that was, of course, allowed as a defense. And I was found guilty of desertion and sentenced, and this is how that happened. Accused and counsel, please rise. We all did. Colonel Nicole, said the judge, you may announce the sentence of the court. Sergeant Mejia Castillo, said the colonel, this court-martial sentences you to be reduced to the grade of E1, to forfeit $795 pay per month for 12 months, to be confined for 12 months, and to be discharged from the service with a bad conduct discharge. When the time came for me to be escorted out of the courtroom to be taken to jail, I asked for a moment to say goodbye to my family. I embraced my stepfather, uncle, aunt, and grandmother. I then turned to my beloved mother. Seeing her reminded me of where my moral strength had come from. She had raised me to always question and to always do the right thing, regardless of the consequences. Thank you. There were no signs of defeat on her face. She told me she loved me, and she kissed me goodbye. As I walked out of the courthouse, I was not sad or bitter, nor was I afraid. Instead, I experienced a deep sense of empowerment on that beautiful day. Looking back, I can see what a long trip it had been to arrive at an understanding of my life that today seems perfectly clear. I realize now that my refusal to participate in a morally indefensible war was one I should have made from the very beginning. But it took the experience of going to war for me to see things in a broader perspective and realize that I was deep down a conscientious objector. It can be claimed that a particular war is justified politically, or that it has the support of the international community and the blessing of international law. But these arguments can never convey the images, the sounds, the smells, or anything that remotely depicts the full horror of war. Escaping those arguments is the irreversible damage war always inflicts upon humanity and upon everything worth loving on earth. War, ultimately, is the destruction of life. Even if before deploying to Iraq, I had been convinced by the lies that we were going to find weapons of mass destruction and that we were fighting against global terrorism, and even if all those lies had turned out to be true, there is no doubt in my heart that today I still would hate and oppose all war. There were times in Iraq when I failed to see things the way I was supposed to as a soldier, when I knew that what we call targets were in fact homes, public squares, or markets, when I knew that what we called enemy combatants, terrorists, or Saddam loyalists were in fact people, sons, daughters, parents, human beings. On those occasions, when I destroyed human life in failing to refuse my orders, I also failed myself, my soldiers, the Iraqi people, and humanity. I should have resisted my orders, and I should have fought for the dignity and preservation of life. I didn't because I was too afraid, because even without chains or shackles, I was still a prisoner of my own fear. I knew the right path to take. I knew what my actions should have been, but I didn't feel free to do what in my heart I knew to be the right thing. I now know exactly what it was that so empowered me as I left my trial. Though I was handcuffed as I walked down the steps of the courthouse to the police vehicle, that was the moment that I gained my freedom. I understood then that freedom is not something physical, but a condition of the mind and of the heart. On that day, I learned that there is no greater freedom than the freedom to follow one's conscience. That day, I was free in a way I had never been before. Thank you.
pay for that or what?
To